Hello, welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking about why I think a TTRPG, or tabletop role-playing game, is in fact a game-making game, or to put it another way, in fact, several games in one. I came to this conclusion while I was developing my own TTRPG, Dream of the Dragon, link below. Dream of the Dragon is an indie and OSR adjacent game that I made. And one of the things that I really realized when I was doing it is that I think most of us GMs want to tinker with the rules. Maybe we have a setting that has interesting purposes or interesting races in it, or special orders of knights or something, and we want to make a new class or a new race. How do we do that? And so I built into my game the concept that GMs can build their own homebrews based on rules. So there's two tiers to Dream of the Dragon. The first tier is the one the players play at, which I call the game, and that is a class-based system. The second tier is one that I call the engine, and that is a point-based system that you use to build classes, races, and other things like spells and so forth. So what I think is that a TTRPG is in fact a game-making game. The best way to explain why I think this is to unpack three different games that I see in a TTRPG. The first, most obvious one, is the game the players are playing. But what game are the players really playing? I think a pretty classic definition of a game is something in which you have players, you have various moves they can make, various forms of success or failure, and is usually either competitive or cooperative. If it's competitive, then you have one winner and one or more losers, or one team wins and the other team loses. If it's cooperative, then there's a cooperative goal that is trying to be met, which has to do with success and failure, and possibly with scoring if there's a way that score is being kept. What game are the players actually playing? As I thought about that, I realized the game they're really playing is the game the game master has made for them. Let's suppose the game master makes an adventure. Now that adventure is in itself essentially a game. It defines the moves that can be made. It defines the conditions under which people will be successful or fail, whether they live or die, whether they get treasure, and so forth. It can be a game that can be broken down into many different games, as other people have done, but I'm not going to do that. I mean, I could break it down into resource management sub-games and combat sub-games and so forth, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say that there's this thing that the game master has presented, which is in and of itself a game. Now, I'm going to suggest that the system is actually more like the engine. If we think of things in terms of computer games, you have the engine, right? And then on top of that, you have the game, and you could have multiple games. I think it's kind of like that with a TTRPG system. The TTRPG system tells the game master how to make the game. So the game master can create like a big maze with rooms, fill them with monsters and treasure and traps and so forth. That is the game. That's the board, as it were. The system tells the game master how to lay all that out, what stats an orc has, what different classes can do, what different racial abilities people have, how magic works, etc. But it's not even that simple, because consider that not only can the GM affect the setting, but the GM actually has the power to change the rules. What's very interesting about this is the system is only a set of guidelines for how the game master can make the game that they are presenting to the players. Okay? And now, even if the game master uses a pre-written adventure module, that adventure is still nevertheless going to be something that will change depending on the game master who uses it. They may adapt it to a larger campaign or to a particular setting. They may adapt it for a particular system. But even if they play for the system for which it was made, even if it's a one-shot or a solo game that's not connected to a campaign, even if it's settingless, you just appear at the dungeon, there are still decisions that the game master will make that affect the game the players are playing. You see, because how the monsters interact with them, for example, what tactics they use, a whole bunch of decisions like that can affect how an adventure feels to somebody with one kind of GM versus another kind of GM. The second game is the one the GM is playing with the system. Okay, so that is, there's a toolbox, and I can make whatever game I want out of this. My analogy is that it's a little bit like playing with model trains. And depending on how you laid it out, you're going to have all sorts of different configurations. So the actual train itself and the landscape that it goes through is, by analogy, sort of like what the GM has made. Whereas the train tracks and the train and all the little diorama pieces are ones that the store sells. So how is that a game? How is this scored? Well, this implies the third game, which is the game that the GM is playing with the players. Now, I don't mean the same thing as the game the players are playing. That's the first game. This is the game where the GM is the one who's playing, in a sense, and then there's a sense to which the players are actually the referees. Because how is the second game, game number 2, scored? In other words, it's a kit. You can make any adventure you want, but it could be a good adventure or a bad adventure. How is the GM scored? How is a GM successful at the game of making a game? That's where the players come in. The players are essentially the ones who score the GM. If the players come back for more, that adds to the GM score. Okay, now there's all sorts of reasons why a GM might not want players to come back, which might not factor into that. So, of course, if it's a problem player, if it's a player who's just not suited to the system or to the genre, they really want to do science fiction, you're doing fantasy, or they really want to do 5e Dungeons & Dragons and you're playing RuneQuest, that player may, not want to come back for good reason, for reasons that have nothing to do with the GM. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the players are all ones who want to be playing the system and the genre and so forth that the game master is doing, and that they can play at the time and day, devote the time that's necessary for it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, let's suppose that we get rid of all other factors that are not under the GM's control. And let's suppose that the reasons why a player comes back is because they like it, and the reason why they don't come back is because they don't like it. The GM's game that the GM's playing with the player is the game of figuring out how to entertain the players with this game. Now, what's really interesting about this is that the strategy for the GM in this third game is not typically to cater to the players. In other words, if you're playing a game, you don't really want a wishy-washy GM who just says, okay, yeah, you want, a magic wand of 3 wishes? Sure. You know what? This poof of air comes and a wand of 3 wishes appears. Nobody really wants a GM who's going to do that. What you want is a GM who's going to say, I don't think so, you're only first level. And creates this challenge, because that's what a game is for. We play games in order to be challenged. If we didn't want to be challenged, we wouldn't play games. So what we really want is a GM who will challenge us. But it's more complicated than that, because it's not just about the strategy of the game, how you succeed or how you fail. It's also the aesthetics of the game. So some people want to be playing in a Tolkien-style high fantasy setting. That has very little to do with how challenging it will be. It has almost all to do with what sort of trappings they want for their game. And here, a GM still can't cater to the whims of the players, because it would be insincere. I mean, if you sort of went, gee, high fantasy Lord of the Rings games are hot right now, I think I'm going to do that because I want my players to keep on coming back, and I want to score high at this game I'm playing of making a game. It's going to be kind of insincere. People can kind of tell. Part of the goal or strategy of the GM playing with the players in this way is that the GM is going to want to dig deep and find out what he or she is really passionate about. What sorts of genres do they love? What sorts of adventures do they love? Are they dungeon crawl people, or are they story people, or wilderness people? To really find their voice as a game maker. Maybe you really like to do funhouse dungeons. If you like that, you're probably going to do really great funhouse dungeons. And so part of the game that you're playing with the players would then be to find players who like funhouse dungeons, because they'll probably really enjoy your funhouse dungeon much more than somebody who only did it because their players asked for it. So that means that the game master is ultimately playing is really a game of passion. In other words, it's a game of finding out what you're really passionate about in this hobby and doing your very best with what you're passionate about. And that's very interesting, because that's not normally the strategy that we tend to think of as being good for games. So this explains why GMs enjoy GMing. They're actually playing a game. You see, it would be pretty lame if all you did as a GM is just slave and slave and slave for your players just for their pleasure. Some people might do that, but that would sort of seem like a lot of work for not a whole lot. People GM because they want to play this game of making a game using the system or slightly modifying the system and presenting that game to players who will essentially judge them based on whether they come back for more. And I think that furthermore, we GMs like doing this because it's a very interesting game in that it is a game that has the strategy of digging deep to find what you find passionate in the TTRPG hobby. Secondly, this explains why players like TTRPGs so much better than CRPGs. With a computer, you can't only really do so much. With a live GM, there's this je ne sais quoi we often talk about. But what is that? I think what it really is that the players find that they are playing this very interesting game, which is they're playing a game that another human being has created for them. and this person has created that game for them according to a certain set of parameters given by the rules, and they are actually giving feedback to the GM in terms of whether or not they enjoyed it. And so it's actually encouraging the GM to dig deep and find out what they're passionate about and to be creative. And so there's this really kind of creative, sort of positive feedback loop, I think, that goes on in these games. I will note that all three of these games are actually cooperative. The game the players are playing, the players are cooperating with each other, and the GM is neutral. In the game the GM is playing with the rules, the GM is cooperating with the rules, not competing with them. And in the game that the GM is playing with the players, in which the players are the referees and the GM is the player, in which they basically get rated on whether or not they're doing a good job in entertaining the players with the game, the GM is actually cooperating with the players. So I think that this theory actually kind of explains a lot about role-playing games, and the more I apply it, the more it gives me interesting thoughts about what we're really doing in this hobby and why we really love it.